All right, so welcome everyone. Let us start in the usual way towards a regenerative humanity through our collaborative efforts. Now, last week, I made you do some mathematics. And we solved that little equation, that little question mark, by understanding that systemic design needs another piece in order to make it regenerative. And what that piece is essentially about not making it human design centric, not actor, not intervention centric, but about the whole. And the whole means understanding context. So a business comes in, it settles into a context. Its participation in the context is not just its own achievement, but it is also its place within the whole and how it supports the whole and how the whole supports it. Yeah. So we have, for the last 4 weeks, I think, 4 sessions, we've been discussing design. So this week, we're going to continue discussing design, but from a different angle. So let's look at the economy we're in and what the effects we can see with the design choices that we have made. Yeah. And just as a quick refresher, the economy is a human-made commons, but it is not a deliberately created commons. Rather, it is an emergent commons. So we interact with the economy, not directly. So I cannot buy and sell directly from the economy, but all of my buying and selling contributes to what emerges. Yeah. So you could think of it as being once removed, but the effects of what emerges, the effects of the economy are very real. So that's where I think the understanding gets to be a little difficult, that we are affected through a feedback loop. The economy forms a context within which we operate, but that context is built by our activities in a non-linear, non-direct way. So the only way for us to change that economy is to look at the levers at hand. What levers do we have, and what levers have we built into, designed into the system? So to help us on that discussion, I thought I would play for you the interview by Jon Stewart of Larry Summers, who was a former Treasury Secretary. So this is about 7.5 minutes. So I think you will enjoy this. Let me do all the right things here. Please let me know if you are not able to hear it. Here goes.
Happened to us as we had massive stimulus and an economy that could only produce so much. We had huge levels of demand, and those huge levels of demand kept pushing up prices and pushing up wages. But ultimately, it was you put too much water in the bathtub overflows. You put too much demand into the economy, and you get high and rising prices.
But the San Francisco Fed says that is, demand is maybe 30 to 35% of the inflation. Wages are really around 20% of the inflation. There's a huge corporate profit aspect to it. There's a huge supply chain aspect to it. But our method for controlling it seems really much more focused on wages and employment.
There's certain sicknesses you can have where there's a drug and it has side effects. And everybody hates the side effects, and no doctor wants their patient to suffer the side effects. But if you don't address the sickness, you're gonna have a bigger problem down the road.
But the stock market assets have gone up 150%. CEO pay has gone up 1,500%. Workers' wages haven't gone up at all. I think you're misdiagnosing the sickness.
First, John, inequality is a terrible thing. The most serious problem the American economy has been the cleavages between those like you and me who are very fortunate. That's why we need a strategy of strengthening labor power in the economy. The question, though, is it an issue that somebody whose control is over setting interest rates and printing money can do much about? Now, you could say that they shouldn't have responded to the 2009 recession by cutting money, by cutting interest rates. You could say that.
Yes,
but
you could.
Do you really think, and certainly that wasn't what progressives were saying at that time.
It doesn't matter.
At that time, progressives were saying we need lower interest rates so people can borrow money to buy houses and put people to work.
But they were
lower
stimulating
interest rates
it
for car loans.
At the corporate level, where they just put the money in the hands of the bankers and say, you decide. This pandemic was the first time the government, in my opinion, did the thing that they're supposed to do in a crisis. When you look at the stimulus payments that went out, 70% of it was being used for rent and food. And if you look at the recovery in the pandemic versus the recovery from 2008, when you stimulated the economy at the demand level, jobs had plunged in the pandemic, and then they shot back up. The recovery in 2009 was painstaking, but the stock market did great. So our fiscal policy and our monetary policy has always been on the side of corporate easing.
Just so we're clear, if you talk to African-American voters, if you talk to Hispanic voters, talk to voters who don't have college degrees, they regard the country's biggest problem as having to do with inflation. So while you may see this as having been tremendously successful, our fellow Americans who don't live as comfortably as you and I do have a lot of questions, John, about what's happened. And it's not hard to understand why they have a lot of questions in light of what's happened to their purchasing power.
But you're suggesting their purchasing power.
We took a good idea and overdid it.
I disagree.
By providing for too much inflation.
But what you're not addressing is not all of inflation was stimulus. The tools that we have, though, are basically saying to somebody, everyone's paying more for gas and groceries, and that's really hard. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to throw 10 million of them out of work so that we all don't have to share that burden. Why aren't we attacking corporate profit in any way? Because that's been estimated to be 30% of inflation, 40% of inflation.
I don't think it's a tenable view that all of a sudden corporations became greedy. Of course there's monopolies in the economy, John, and we should be for
They've been bragging about it on
much more aggressive
earnings calls.
Than we were.
On their earnings calls, they're saying our profits have never been higher. We're killing it. The markups during the pandemic are sometimes they're saying 70% of what they were.
If there was a huge increase in the demand for shrewd television commentary, I imagine the demand for what you do would go way up. And I imagine you'd convert that into higher wages and getting more and getting paid better.
You're saying it's the market at work.
I don't think you'd call yourself a gouger when you...
I would absolutely call myself a gouger.
When you did that.
And by the way, the effect of the talk show business is very different than the effect of ExxonMobil, right? I mean, let's be fair.
Isn't this show going to be on Apple TV?
Correct.
And I think Apple TV is worth about 5 times as much as Exxon. I think Apple's price, since the stimulus began, Apple's value has gone up by about $1.2 trillion.
Right.
That's $4,000 for every American, just an increase in the value of Apple.
You just made my point for me.
Do you feel that Apple is somehow gouging or doing something wrong?
Yes, of course. And Exxon is, and Mobil is.
So let's talk about Apple. Let's talk about Apple. Do you think Apple should just sell phones for less and not have enough phones? What would you have Apple do?
You're saying to me, John, market forces are market forces. And if demand goes up, are you suggesting, young man, that Apple should charge less than they could charge? Let me flip that on you. When there's a tightness in the labor market, what you're saying is the workers shouldn't do the same. That the workers, just following the same capitalistic principles that allow Apple to charge more for their phones, shouldn't charge more because wage inflation is driving inflation.
That's not at all what I'm saying, John.
That's exactly what you're saying.
Actually, it isn't. Every worker should get as high a wage as they can. It would be a terrible idea.
But the Fed is going to intervene. The Fed is going to intervene to make that not possible.
No, the Fed is intervening to control the overall level of demand growth.
And what will that do to? And what will that do to the labor market?
Much faster.
What will that do to the labor market? What will it do to the labor market? It will loosen it.
Likely to lead to
looser labor markets.
A somewhat looser labor market.
Exactly.
We hope to minimize that consequence.
That was good, wasn't it?
That was painful and funny.
Yes, yes. So, okay. I have put down some points that I took from that. Not at all comprehensive by any means, but I thought it would be a good way to spur discussion here. Now, I don't have a background in economics, but something stood out just from what we have been discussing over nearly 1 year, especially if I look at it from a systems perspective, a complex system perspective, what things stood out. So the discussion started with an attempt to understand today's inflation. So Larry Summers said the stimulus package, now for those of you who are not in the United States, stimulus was money, actual cash, not cash, checks that were sent out to people who live in the United States. I think it was twice during the pandemic. These were not very large amounts of money, but let's say $800, $900, something like that, sent out twice to different people. Yeah. So Larry Summers is saying, because that much money was put into the economy, and when he says economy, he's saying merely that it went into the hands of people. People used or spent that money. The spending of that money created huge demand, which pushed up prices and wages. So he's saying today's increased prices and wages, which is called inflation, is due to the stimulus entering the economy. Now, mind you, the size of that stimulus is quite small if you look at it from in terms of annual wages. So 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200, something like that. That's it, huh? That's it. So Jon Stewart says, well, it's been found that only 30 to 35% of inflation is from demand. By demand, we mean consumer demand, right? And 20% is wages. But our method for controlling inflation is to control wages and employment, right? So we put the stimulus in, but if we want to control inflation, that is increasing prices, we must decrease demand and decrease wages. And one of the ways they do that, as John pointed out, is they throw 10 million people out of a job. Okay. So on the other hand, if they look at stock market assets, now this was post 2009, stock market assets have increased by 150% and CEO pay by 1,500%, but wages have not increased. Now, we can see why CEO pay has gone up that high, because CEO pay is usually reflected in increase in stock prices. It has nothing whatsoever to do with any other parameter of corporate performance other than market capitalization as seen through the stock market, right? So then, of course, this raised the idea of inequality, and Larry Summers' idea of how to handle inequality is to strengthen labor power. I found that very odd. So strengthening labor power means things like voting rights, unions, and things like that. So it isn't about the economy as such. It isn't about using the levers of economy, but about creating a fight between labor market and government and corporate markets. So now he's suggesting that we should go outside of economic activities and help the inequality or help the poor by creating a battle between them. Yeah? So the other interesting point Larry brought up, he actually said, now he's talking about the Fed here, the central government, somebody whose control is over setting interest rates and printing money. What he's talking about here, we said that the economy is an emergent commons, an emergent property. The only lever that the central government seems to have are changing interest rates and printing money. And so the question becomes, what can they actually do? And my own point here is, there is a problem in the way we have designed our structure if the only levers are interest rates and printing money. Yeah. So he brought up that after 2009, maybe we should have lowered interest rates. And Jon said very clearly, lowering interest rates, what does lowering interest rates do? It actually harms regular people, you and me, because the interest we get in our savings accounts drops. Yeah. But it helps those who take a loan, which is really about investment. So it helps companies. And which companies? Because family businesses, although they do take loans, small businesses, but their loan amount is small. So what it is really doing is it's stimulating at the corporate level. It is telling corporations who take loans in the order of 100 million, 200 million, that you now have lower interest rate. Even if you don't need the money, take the loan. So it is very much a trickle-down approach where the corporations are supposedly creating jobs for the employees. So then the discussion moves from discussing pure inflation to discussing the recovery after the 2009 financial crisis versus the recovery after the pandemic. So Jon points out that 70% of the stimulus money, remember that money that was sent out to the citizens directly, 70% of that money was being spent on food and rent. That right away says to you that citizens were under pressure. They were not able to feed themselves. And that was, of course, because of the very large job reduction during the pandemic. So there was a large plunging of job market during the pandemic. But then when the pandemic close downs were over, they shot back up. But the recovery after 2009 was painstaking, painful for the individuals, for the citizens, but the stock market boomed. Now we can see that right away because we were talking about reduced interest rates. Reduced interest rates ensured that corporations could jump back up to a level that they had never seen before. Yeah. So Larry Summers talks about how the people at lower income levels, but I would say everybody, is really primarily concerned about inflation. So we really should only be focusing on inflation because inflation is where we live. We pay the rent, we buy food, we send children to school. Our purchasing power has decreased dramatically because of inflation. And I agree with that. I live in New York and I can tell you. So Larry Summers' point is that the stimulus money that went out is the main cause of inflation. And Jon says, no, corporate profit is estimated to be 30 to 40% of inflation. And corporations have come out and said their profits have never been higher. The markup that they put on their products, sometimes as high as 70%, have not gone down, meaning they are continuing to reap those sort of profits, even though the pandemic is officially over and everybody is back working. This is what Jon talked about as gouging, Apple gouging the consumers. The other point that Jon brought up was that the talk show business is very different than ExxonMobil. That's clear, but I thought it's worth thinking about from a systems perspective. Both are businesses, both have customers, consumers, both are affected by job, wages, and so on. But the contexts of both are vastly different. The effect it has on our livability, if you will, how we can live life, how we live life, is vastly different. And that, I think, is very important for us to keep in mind as we try and approach our analysis through a systems perspective. And finally, really the crux of this whole thing was that the Fed is trying to control the inflation by controlling demand. That is the ability for people to buy, which loosens the labor market, which means wages drop or jobs are lost. At least in the United States, for the last, I would say, 6 months, there have been massive numbers of layoffs, and it looks like it's continuing. Yeah. Okay. So as we move into discussion, I wanted to just remind everybody that when we talk about regenerative business, we talk about businesses living within the business system, our business ecosystem, as a part of the whole, as creating and participating in a healthy ecosystem. So it recognizes its context and it evolves with the context. So this is important. Unlike Larry Summers' points about corporate easing, which implies that the business does not need to understand what the people in its context are going through. So if we reduce the interest rates, corporations can take more loans, they can produce, et cetera, but the fact that the people are suffering, their purchasing power has gone down, inequity is rising, is no concern of the business. So this theory, this way of looking at things, really puts businesses outside of the context of community. Essentially, it makes it stand outside, if you will, outside the world. Not quite sure how they do that, but that's what they're doing here. And so here's my discussion for you. How could we design for regenerative outcomes? This was a level of discussion in the video that I wouldn't have been able to come up with myself because I'm not an economist, but something I put to the group. How can we design for regenerative outcomes? Michael, you have to start because you have a background in economics. You have to.
Oh, Lord. Colleen raised her hand, please.
Go, Colleen.
Well, we've given this a lot of thought, obviously, as we have put together Rainbird Villages. And so what we don't want to do is go against human nature, because human nature will subvert you if you don't acknowledge it. So we do have a pay scale that based on, if somebody is really ambitious and whatever, they do get a reward for being ambitious. but it's not 1,000 times greater than the lowest employee. It's only like 6 to 8 times higher than the lowest employee. And so and since the employees own the corporation, they all gain together. So there's a good incentive for people to be productive, because it not only raises your boat, it raises all the boats in the community. And we're also kind of leaving out all of the people who are siphoning off all this stuff right now, because the siphons are killing all of us. And the interest rates and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's sad. And I have several friends that are now out of work. You know, how are they going to eat? How are they going to survive? And they're high level, very well trained people. And so, and they've got mortgages to pay. You know, and so in our communities, we're trying to inflation proof it to a certain extent. And we're also trying to keep the money within the community as much as possible. So it's just not always going out. But at the same time, we do want to incentivize people to be creative and, you know, take risks and all that kind of stuff. Because, you know, for every person who takes a risk and you know, really makes it big, there are tons of people who take risks and don't make it at all. So it's a matter of bringing back to a community level. It's more human sized, it's more humane, and it just plain works better. So,
How would you answer on that? It makes sense that community sized, human sized, and keep the profits inside. But you know, there are things that maybe a community cannot produce, like wheat for food. And that depends on geolocation, depends on all kinds of things. The other things are medicines and so on. So how does one incorporate that into this thinking?
well, eventually we hope to have communities that will do all of it. It may not, it'll take a while, and we'll have to, but you know, if you have land and you have food production and you have production of other goods and services, and we have multiple revenue streams, it puts us in a very strong position for bargaining for those other things.
Yeah.
Because we're not begging, we have something to trade. And so as other people are, you know, finding themselves begging, we're not going to be begging. And our whole the Rainbird Village is designed to produce at least 80 to 90% of what it needs. So that means that you're only going to have to be trading, you know, at the 10% level, not at the 50 or 60 or 80% level. So
yeah. So I'm not sure that that's actually possible. I mean, imagine Alaska. What that says for Alaska then is that 80-90% of the time they should be eating only what's been sort of, quote, traditional, which is whale blubber and so on. And other things should only be 20-30%. How do you even control that?
Well, I mean, we have to ask ourselves, should people be living in Alaska? I mean, a lot of you know, I mean, our villages, we ask ourselves that all the time, is should we actually be doing this? Does it work with the natural program? Now, I mean, Alaskans do have high value items that they can trade. I mean, all of us love shrimp and crab and all that kind of stuff, which the Alaskans, you know, have in a greater abundance than most of us. But at the same time, you know, indigenous indigenous people have lived there and
Mhm.
thrived, so it all depends on what you want your life to look like.
So what it seems to imply is that the demand for weird things, weird by the local context, such as potato chips, comes from these connections to the outside world. If they didn't exist, there would be no demand.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't have answers to that. I only have one little quote, insight, if you will, that this maximization is the problem. As he said, should Apple not charge as much as it can? So this thing about, I think the phrase is, don't leave money on the table. So every company, should charge as much as it can.
Well, but that's where competition comes in, because a competitor come in and say, I'm happy to have a little less money and I can sell it for much less, but I can get a bigger market. See, but we haven't had even table capitalism for more than 50 years. We have had corporate dominated capitalism and it doesn't work the same. I mean, capitalism is the lemonade stand that the kids do. Capitalism is, I have something that you need and you can borrow it, kind of thing, for a period of time. I have more money than I can spend, so I'm going to give you the money so that you can use it to grow your business, kind of thing. But I mean, when you have people, when protectionism comes in, then all of that goes out the window. Because if corporations are protecting their turf and there can't be any competition anymore.
Yeah, I think the idea of competition is misrepresented. Because competition is easy and possible on simple things. But when it comes to things that are difficult and convoluted and requires years of training, like medicine. So what we are seeing, for example, in the pharma sector, although there is competition, that prices only go up. And so then to your example, let's say it's a monopoly, somebody's raising the prices. A competitor comes in and says, well, I'm going to start from their peak and maybe lower it by 2%. It doesn't go down to where it can or should, because each one is trying to maximize their position.
Yeah, but there are also, I mean, we could make a good case for the fact that the pharmaceutical industry has outgrown its usefulness, because it has become something that is fighting nature rather than consistent with nature. You could make the same argument for big agriculture, that it's fighting nature and it's not going along with nature. And so, I mean, our whole idea in Rainbow Villages is how do we keep people healthy, not how do we treat their sicknesses. And so by keeping people healthy, they don't need the pharmaceuticals as much. I mean, I'm not against medicine, because, if I get in an accident, I want you to take me to the hospital, but I'm sure not going to go to a doctor for nutritional advice or for lifestyle advice. Because most of them, I mean, it's not that there aren't some among the ranks that are really good at that, because I know some that are, but generally speaking, it's
yeah. I like what Catherine's saying about optimization, that I agree that maximization will always find a way. It will change the market in order to maximize profits. And optimization is much more looking at the whole, but also looking at the relationship, the relationship between buyer, seller, and so on. So, but Dave has been waiting in the dark for quite a while. So, David.
Actually, I'm waiting in bright light, which is part of the problem. Surrounded by windows.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so many different ideas, but I've thoughts coming up from this session, and thanks that interview with Larry is always interesting to see Summer's talk. It feels to me like one of the things we could do constructively is look at traditional economics, the academic field, and like identify the pieces that do apply to some of the things that we're talking about, right? Because it's not like we were making these things up. They've been asking these questions for a long time, and they, there is things in the model that respond to us, So, and I think, for example, the stuff between increasing the power of labor is really interesting, because clearly there is a large negotiation going on in the market. And one of the negotiations that's always gone on is between labor and capital, and this is like Marx. I mean, we've been talking about this one for a long time. And historically in the United States over the last few decades, there have been laws passed that have weakened the power of labor. And the laws often manage this commons we're talking about, right? So it's not like the notion that the market is a natural thing isn't correct. The market is something that's constructed by people, but by people in all kinds of different settings, right? So people can choose where to work. They can vote for people who do things in government. There's all kinds of rules that surround the market. So and so like, and like, I don't know, even microeconomics, you have the supply demand curves, and you have that those prices get set, but within a range, right? Because there's this notion of consumer surplus. If a consumer can buy something at a price, but they would have paid more, right, for that thing because they like it so much. That range is consumer surplus, right? So if you would have paid $2,000 for your $1,000 iPhone, you got $1,000 of consumer surplus. And that also is like, if you're not getting that kind of surplus, that drives the price down. That happens in labor as well, right? If Walmart can afford to pay people minimum wage because those people are getting support from SNAP food supplies from the federal government, right? So they can afford to work at very low wages. That'll change wage prices. So there's all kinds of negotiations going on in the system. And economics has been trying to deal with, kind of describe it. To me, the interesting bit then is like, okay, what economics has talked about these things, what's different when you put the regeneration framing in here? How does that change things? And one of the things I was wondering about is like in the market, we talk about capital and labor, and it's like, well, what are we missing in that? And so one of the things that's come out from a lot of the business people is multiple stakeholder kind of perspectives. Like business the Friedman perspective is business serves shareholders. But Carol Sanford will argue that businesses actually should support employees, the community, their suppliers, as well as shareholders, and so and their customers, right? So that there's a whole bunch of things that need to be considered by a business perspective. And that probably changes the dynamics of the negotiations if you could somehow enforce that, perhaps with laws, where it's like make the companies responsible for what happens in their community. Well, and then the other notion, I'll just toss it in there because I was thinking about it in terms of like when we talk about playing nice, this notion of playing nice, and we translate it to living systems. It's like, what does that mean, right? Because living systems, things die, they get compost, they get killed. They, there's a lot of things that red and tooth and claw kinds of things in living systems. And and in economics, there's this Schumpeter's notion of constructive constructive destruction or something that the economics is trying to internalize some of these things. You have to destroy businesses in order for new businesses to flourish. So what one of the questions that I've been hearing from other people is like, what is it about our current economy that we need to compost? It needs to die, and we need to compost it, and we're going to build it back better somehow. But playing nice is probably not really the right framing. It's something a little bit more.
So I will say that these words that come from the field of morality or morals, like nice and good, are not relevant, I think, to living systems. Living systems are about evolution, but not in the Darwinian sense. So just to be clear on that.
Well, and one other stakeholder that would be fun is this notion of what if there were non-human players who had stakes in some of these things. So this notion that a mountain should have rights or a river should have rights. That also would be
right.
Maybe.
Right. But I really object to that point he made about labor power. I really object to the idea that the way that the economy should reach a optimal balance should be through battle. I do not agree with that. Now, I'm not saying power games and battle would 100% go away, but it shouldn't be the central mechanism, because because that takes the economy and makes it into a pathological mechanism, just as the pharma industry has made the view of health pathological. That means you start with pathology. It's almost as though good health is an outcome, a side effect of that pathological view. And I don't agree with that. If our central theme should be the assumption of health. And if pathologies arise, that's something we can deal with. So, Rick.
Yeah, I have a question for Michael. So I want to follow up with a conversation with you about this for a bit more detail. And I put it into this comment there, and that is the languaging of economic commons and economic markets and how it relates to the design of equities or inequities. I agree with you, Janisha. Equities and equities are not a feature of natural living systems. They're human constructs. And we can design them in such a way so that Colleen can go off and have her little micro village where it's much more equitable. But when the macro level system is swimming against you, it's a tsunami against you, then it's very difficult to scale something like that. But Michael, I'll be curious to just hear your economic perspective about the difference when people use the language economic commons versus economic market. Could you help me understand what the distinctions and similarities are?
So let me first say that while I do have formal training as an economist, I've walked away from it for some time, and B, I do think that there's no. I'm going to. I think you made a great point, and I had raised my hand for a reason. That just like, for example, in medieval times in the West, there were a series of fictions about how to govern the state, that the role of the Holy Roman Empire was, there was this theological construct that gave rights and apportioned, to certain stewardship over land, that they then maintained the people on that land and the goods of that land. And it was all kind of, as you pointed out, this invented fiction. And that while we walked away from that fiction in the West through the Enlightenment, that really we assimilated a new series of fictions that sometimes are every bit as mythical and magical as how many angels could dance on the pin of a head. People could get into very animated conversations about it, and it was imaginary in many, many ways. And that remains true today, that there are these, like when we talk about, I live in the Washington area, right? And that there is a river that comes through the area called the Potomac. And that if you're on one side of the river, people talk about Virginia. And if you're on the other side, people talk Maryland. In nature, those two states are not real. Right? Those are social constructs that we use to, and there are different ways in which the people of Virginia self-regulate and cover, but in a different sense, they're fictions that are used to organize, and some would say more or less skillfully. And so it's really important to kind of contemplate whether or not we're debating a fiction that we might not choose anymore, because it's turns out to be like talking about angels on the head of a pin. And that is one of the existential points. The thing that I'd raised my hand about was, one of the ways in which we track this thing we call economies, right, are these monetized GDP figures, right? That we know are problematic in many different ways, but they basically use currency as a way to then quantify activity. And if the activity is not if it's not monetized, if it's not financially done, like caring, the care economy is, and so much of the care economy is not financialized, therefore it's invisibilized in this whole framework, right? And so there's this whole thing about by using the constructs of empire, will we change the empire? Or I think I've heard it a different way, using the master's tools, will you get rid of the plantation? I don't know. But what David was saying about a negotiation is definitely one of these things that I think is at the heart, and it may not be nice negotiation. It may be a kind of forceful, because there are people that are perfectly happy with the way things are, and those who are not are the ones who have to decide, do they want to renegotiate and what exactly does that mean? And so last thing I'll kind of get to was in our current, in the US, the economy, the workforce in the financial sector is about 7%. The share of the US profits is between 25 and 30% each year. That and the pharmaceutical industry are the two most profitable industries in surplus profit generating in the economy. Pharmaceuticals have protected patent rights that enable them to command rents that are kind of exorbitant. There are similar kind of structural and institutional rents available to the financial industry that then lead to these surplus process, not because they're doing so much extra for driving the productivity of the economy, but they are protected classes that when liquidity is put into the market, it goes into, like Tanuja was saying, loans, and it's like that's not, they're buying back their own stocks, they're investing in capital, and so the inflation is happening in the within the stock market, in stock prices, and because the owners of that don't mind if there's inflation in that space, it appears to be a positive thing, but it's a fiction that is driven as much by the infusion of this currency liquidity and if you will, transferring assets to the capital classes. The myth is that these capital classes are allocating this money in benevolent ways that are efficient for all. And to use an example, and there are millions of them, down the street from where I live, there was a slum area on the waterfront of the Potomac that for 30 years, 50 years, couldn't get a nickel thrown its way. And there was plenty of surplus money in the economy, but they could not get money thrown their way. Why? Because it was perceived as a slum. Some Dutch folks and some Arab folks saw, there's this neighborhood in the heart of Washington, D.C. It could be developed into such a nice thing. And because they were not, quote unquote, American investors who didn't have American mindsets of where the money should go, what was a rent, what would be profitable, what was risky, not risky, they invested in what is now a waterfront. And not everybody would think that this waterfront is just another, capital development. Not everybody would think it a good thing. But the point is that the investment flowed from places outside of Wall Street and outside of the American investment market. Why? Because there are a whole set of prejudices and mindsets about where the money should go that were assumed to be the smartest people in the room, and not just the most privileged who were perpetuating their privileges. So there's a whole range of things that are like, by accepting that the premise of the marketplace is the accurate way to see what is going on and to discuss the dynamics of the economy through monetized financial dynamics, that is perhaps something that we need to start questioning, whether or not people like me, in fact, or trained like me, belong at the front of the room. So with that, I know that was a lot, but
No, that was great. That was great. What you're pointing out is we need a lot more understanding of complex systems, and the idea that the metrics, whether it's GDP or anything else, is really a pointer to something else. So then people say, well, okay, if it's just a pointer, can't we get to the real thing? No, you can never get to the real thing. You will always be in a position of pointer. So the real skill set becomes how to design pointers and then change them when you think they're no longer providing service. So that seems to be the real skill here. And we have no training in any of that, zero. So one of the things I think would be wonderful if that would come out of this group perhaps would be if we could have a visualization, a visual diagram of how the flows in our current economic system are causing inequity. So what was very important for me in this dialogue between Jon Stewart and Larry Summers was that Larry Summers saying that they are loosening the labor market in order to control inflation, but that obviously is increasing inequity, obviously. And so if we had more of these sort of diagrams that sort of showed the flow of what systems do when certain things happen, I think that would be very beneficial.
A kind of indicator that has been, some would say, within complexity, the idea of fractals is this idea of measuring the system in a new way, and a way that we've talked about it here before. When you talk about, for example, the watershed, and you say not how are individuals, how much water are they consuming and are consuming individually, but you put it within a common context of what is the carrying capacity of the watershed, and how does what I do fit when is compared to what everybody else is doing. So it's transparent, it's not self-reporting, it's co-visualized concurrently. It creates co-regulatory capabilities that otherwise are hidden because everybody's just talking about their own reasons why they're individually wonderful, and not the externalities and the cost that they're producing in, pretty front and dirty in the back kind of thing.
It seems to be the normal way of living life these days. Right? A pretty front and who cares what's in the back. So folks, we are at the end of the hour. I know this was a bit of a technical discussion today, but I thought that interview was very important for us to understand. I would like if folks would be willing to raise their hands and bring up any article or interesting thing that they've come across and present it to the group for discussion. That it plugs us into the reality of today's economy. And I think that would be wonderful. So Colleen, did you just raise your hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Rick's idea that our tiny little villages, are going to be fighting this big thing. But that's how Mondragon started. It was a tiny little village fighting the big thing. And now it's one of the biggest manufacturers in all of Europe. So you have to start somewhere. And I fully anticipate that we're going to have pushback. But the more people can see that this works for everyone better, and they want to be part of something that works, and we'll stay under the radar as long as we can. But eventually it'll get big enough to get noticed, and by then it'll be too big to stop. So
Yeah,
we hope.
yeah. Colleen, are you pretty familiar with Mondragon? If you are, it would be wonderful if you presented.
Yeah, our governance model is based on Mondragon.
Oh, so that would be wonderful if you could bring that to the table, if you will.
Yep.
So, yeah. David, would you like to do donut economics? Is that something you feel comfortable doing?
I don't think I could lead it. We could try to find somebody else. I think I haven't read the book yet, but I got someday.
Yeah.
It's on my list.
And I think all the lab work that they're doing, it's gone pretty far ahead now. So
There's
we
actual
need someone who's
projects in the field kind of, and I don't know how to get to those, but it'd be
They have
interesting.
a handbook for business that we might be able to discuss if you want. I have a copy of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. But then we need someone to sort of lead that discussion. I'm going to switch off recording.